Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, is another progressive neurodegenerative disorder. It primarily affects motor neurons that are in the cerebral cortex, brainstem, and spinal cord, leading to weakness in muscles, atrophy, and ultimately paralysis. It involves selective degeneration of our upper and lower motor neurons, and it typically presents insidiously and then progresses relentlessly. There is sporadic ALS is the most common type where there's no clear inheritance pattern and there's lots of environmental and epigenetic factors at play, but no known cause. There is a familial ALS, which is much smaller, 5 to 10% of cases, but in this form, it's autosomal dominant in most cases with some key genes involved. The SOD1 gene or superoxide dismutase gene was the first identified, and this leads to a toxic gain of function. C9orf72 leads to a hexanucleotide repeat expansion, which is the most common genetic cause of familial ALS. The TARDBP encodes TDP43, which is a DNA RNA binding protein. And lastly, FUS, this is another RNA binding protein. Again, though, familial is the least common type. In ALS, our upper motor neuron degeneration really affects motor neurons in the primary motor cortex or BETS cells, which leads to spasticity, hyperreflexia, clonus, and certain pathologic reflexes like Babinski's sign. Our lower motor neuron degeneration affects the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, as well as our cranial nerve motor nuclei, especially 5, 7, 9, 10, and 12. This leads to facial muscle or muscle weakness and atrophy, fasciculations, hypotonia, and hyporeflexia. The corticospinal tract, essentially the tract that sends information from the cortex to the spinal cord, degenerates. And this leads to sclerosis or gliosis and scarring of the lateral columns of the spinal cord, which that's why it's called lateral sclerosis. There are some different mechanisms molecularly. One is excitotoxicity due to excessive glutamate signaling, which typically is there's impaired reuptake by astrocytes. Oxidative stress, especially in the SOD1 mutations, mitochondrial dysfunction and protein aggregation, impaired RNA metabolism, neuroinflammation and activation of our microglial cells, and issues with axonal transport. The spared functions are sensory neurons, the autonomic nervous system, the ocular motor nerves, so eyes can still maintain movement, and sphincter control is typically preserved until really late in the disease. Some non-modifiable risk factors are age. Peak onset is 55 to 75. There is an AMAB predominance compared to AFAB individuals, and family history, especially with a familial linkage. Some modifiable risk factors include smoking, military service, or strenuous physical activity. This is strenuous, or this is controversial as a risk factor because it's not necessarily proven, it's just a correlation. Exposure to heavy metals or pesticides and head trauma or chronic infections. This is more hypothesized. This is not confirmed. ALS clinically will initially look like an asymmetric limb weakness, so foot drop, hand weakness, and then muscle cramps and fasciculations, and it could begin with either bulbar or limb involvement. Some upper motor neuron signs, like I mentioned, spasticity, brisk te deep tendon reflexes, clonus, or a positive Babinski. And lower, you can see muscle wasting, fasciculations, a flaccid paralysis, and areflexia or hyporeflexia. The bulbar involvement includes dysarthria, dysphagia, tongue atrophy and fasciculations, nasally speech, and a pseudobulbar effect where there's emotional lability or inappropriate laughing or even inappropriate crying. And then respiratory muscles get involved later on, and that typically involves shortness of breath like dyspnea, orthopnea, low ventilations, and a morning headache due to nocturnal carbon dioxide retention. Cognitively, in about a quarter to half of cases, we'll see frontotemporal dysfunction, which is more executive dysfunction where there's apathy or a language impairment. There can be some overlap with frontotemporal dementia, especially with certain mutations. And ultimately, the complications are respiratory failure, which is the most common cause of death, and aspiration pneumonia, malnutrition or cachexia due to inability to swallow, and mobility-related issues and communication barriers, mental and emotional conditions, and caregiver stress, And death typically occurs within 3 to 5 years of symptom onset, but the range is a little bit wider than that.